Before the towering skyscrapers, before the roaring highways, and long before the glowing screens of modern life, there were quiet roads, unpaved and dusty, where the early story of America moved slowly, like a drifting river. This is the untold, almost forgotten tale of the moments that never made it to the headlines, but quietly shaped a nation. Before the towering skyscrapers, before the roaring highways, and long before the glowing screens of modern life, there were quiet roads, unpaved and dusty, where the early story of America moved slowly, like a drifting river. This is the untold, almost forgotten tale of the moments that never made it to the headlines, but quietly shaped a nation. It is the early 1600s. Across the wide and endless Atlantic, a fragile wooden ship drifts under gray skies. Inside, a group of settlers sit silently. Some are families with children, some are skilled tradesmen, carpenters and farmers. Others are simply dreamers, unsure of what they will find. Their journey has been long and difficult, filled with cold nights, damp clothes, and the ever-present creak of the ship's wooden frame. But after weeks at sea, a faint strip of coastline appears on the horizon. This new land feels strange, wild, and endless. Tall forests stretch as far as the eye, can see rivers wind like silver threads through untouched valleys. There are no familiar buildings, no market squares, no churches with ringing bells, only the vast and quiet unknown. The settlers step onto the shore with caution. Their boots sink slightly into the wet sand. The salty air mixes with the earthy smell of pine and soil. They feel both fear and hope. Fear of the unknown, hope for a better life. But there are no grand speeches, no cheering crowds. Only the slow, careful unloading of supplies from the ship, barrels of flour, crates of tools, heavy chests of nails, and bundles of rough wool blankets. The first shelters are simple, a few logs stacked into crude walls, roofs covered in wooden shingles quickly nailed together. Smoke rises from small fires as meals of salted meat and hard bread are prepared. Life here is not heroic or dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and often exhausting. Every day is a list of chores: gathering firewood, fetching water from the nearby stream, mending broken tools, and patching torn clothing. The work never ends, but neither do the small victories: a new roof that keeps out the rain, a field finally cleared of rocks, a loaf of bread that tastes almost like home. The settlers are not alone. In the forests, native tribes watch from a distance. Sometimes there is cautious trade furs exchanged for metal tools, corn for cloth. Other times there is quiet tension, a shared understanding that both groups are trying to survive in the same land. These early interactions are often awkward, sometimes kind, and sometimes filled with mistrust. But in these small exchanges, far from the grand battles of history, are the first fragile connections between two worlds. Winters are harsh, snow piles against the rough wooden walls of the cabins, food runs low, days are short, and nights are long and cold. People huddle close to the fire, telling simple stories or sitting in silence, listening to the wind howl outside. Some settlers do not survive the cold months. Their names are not written in history books. There are no statues for them, no holidays in their memory. They are simply forgotten, their graves marked by rough wooden crosses that weather away with time. Yet, life goes on. With each passing year, the settlements grow. Fields of corn and wheat replace patches of forest. Dirt paths slowly become roads. New cabins are built, then barns, then small wooden churches. The settlers hold quiet town meetings, deciding where to build fences or how to share the limited tools they have. There is no grand sense of destiny, no speeches about freedom or independence, just neighbors trying to survive, one day at a time. Children are born, grow up, and learn the same hard lessons their parents did: how to plant crops, how to hunt, how to mend clothes, how to endure long winters. The world they live in feels small, just a handful of cabins, a few fields, and the dark, endless forest beyond. But for them, it is everything. The idea of a nation does not exist yet. The settlers think only of their families, their neighbors, and the next season's harvest. Years pass slowly. Ships from Europe bring new settlers, new tools, and letters from home. But they also bring disease, which spreads quietly through the settlements. There are no doctors, only simple remedies of herbs and prayers. Many die, and yet life continues because it must. Graves are dug, babies are born, and crops are planted again. The settlements slowly become villages. The villages become towns. A small blacksmith shop opens, hammering out nails, horseshoes, and tools. A tiny schoolhouse is built, where children learn to read and write simple words. The first books that arrive are often Bibles or old worn-out stories from Europe. There are no libraries yet, just a few precious books passed from hand to hand. Every so often the settlers gather for small celebrations, harvest festivals with simple foods, or weddings where fiddles play quiet tunes. These moments are rare but precious. A brief pause from the endless work. People dance, laugh, and tell stories late into the night. But when the morning comes, the fields still need to be tended, the firewood chopped, the roofs repaired. Far away, kings and queens in Europe argue over who owns this land. Maps are drawn with bold lines, claiming territories that the settlers themselves barely understand. But for the people living here, politics is a distant concern. Their world is small, and their focus is on the next meal, the next season, and the slow work of survival. That the settlers do not think of themselves as Americans. They are English, Dutch, German, French people from many lands, slowly mixing together in a strange new world. Over time, they begin to see this place not as a temporary stop but as home. New generations grow up never knowing the old countries. The forests and rivers of this new land become their entire world. The years drift by, unmarked by any great event. It is not the kind of history told in textbooks. But these quiet lives, the farmers, blacksmiths, mothers and children, the true foundation of what will one day become the United States. Without them, there would be no towns, no roads, no future cities. They are forgotten now, but they're slow. Patient labor built the first stones of a nation. And as the sun sets behind the forests, casting long shadows across the fields, a stillness settles over the small village. Smoke curls upward from cabin chimneys. The sounds of the day fade, the clatter of tools, the chatter of voices, the barking of dogs. In the darkening sky, stars begin to appear, one by one, as they have for thousands of years. Life is simple, quiet, and steady, but deep within these uneventful days, the story of a nation is quietly being written, one ordinary moment at a time. By the late 1600s, the first settlements had begun to take root. What were once small clusters of rough wooden cabins slowly grew into towns, not bustling cities, but modest communities, each with its own character and rhythm. These towns did not rise overnight. They took decades to form, shaped not by sudden events, but by the quiet persistence of ordinary people. The town square became the heart of many communities. It was rarely grand or impressive, just a simple, open space with a dirt path running through it. Around it stood a few essential buildings, a meeting house where townspeople gathered to discuss local matters, a blacksmith shop with a constant ringing of hammer on metal, and perhaps a small tavern where travelers could find food, drink, and a place to rest. Over time, small wooden houses lined the roads, their gardens growing herbs, vegetables, and flowers that added bits of color to the otherwise rugged landscape. Life in these towns moved slowly, guided by the seasons. Spring meant planting crops. Summer was for tending fields and repairing buildings. Autumn brought harvest, with wagons filled with corn, wheat, and pumpkins. Winter was the hardest time, when snow blocked roads and food supplies dwindled. But each year, the people adapted a little more, learned from their mistakes, and grew wiser about surviving in this new land. Most townspeople knew each other by name. News traveled by word of mouth, carried in conversations at the well or exchanged during church gatherings. There were no newspapers yet, no postal systems as we know them today. A single letter from Europe could take months, sometimes more than a year, to arrive. When such a letter finally came, neighbors might gather to hear it read aloud, fascinated by news of faraway lands they had once called home. Trade was simple but vital. Farmers brought eggs, butter, and grain to exchange for tools or cloth. The blacksmith made nails, horseshoes, and hinges in exchange for food or firewood. Barter was common, for coins were scarce. A neighbor might trade a bushel of apples for a new hoe, or a wool blanket for a sack of flour. Every exchange carried a sense of personal connection. People relied on one another. Because survival depended on cooperation, children had their roles too. Even the youngest helped with chores, feeding chickens, gathering kindling, or fetching water from the well. Education was basic, often taught at home by parents using a single worn-out book. In some towns, a schoolhouse was eventually built, where children of all ages sat together, learning their letters and numbers from one teacher. The lessons were simple: reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and moral instruction. There were no elaborate curriculums or advanced subjects. The main goal was to prepare children for the same hard life. Churches were among the first buildings constructed, often doubling as meeting halls. Sundays were quiet, marked by long services where the preacher's voice filled the room, echoing against wooden walls. Afterward, people lingered outside, discussing the sermon, trading news, or arranging help for neighbors in need. It was in these gatherings that communities bonded most deeply. The legal system was equally simple. Town meetings served as courts, where disputes were settled in front of neighbors. Arguments over fences, livestock, or trade agreements were common. Punishments were modest, but public fines, public apologies, or brief stints in the town stocks. More serious crimes were rare, but when they did occur, justice was harsh. Yet, for the most part, the communities governed themselves with a sense of shared responsibility. There were no professional police, no standing armies, just neighbors working together to keep order. One of the quiet forces shaping these towns was the constant arrival of new settlers. Each new ship brought strangers with different languages, customs, and skills. Some were welcomed warmly, others caused friction, as different cultural practices clashed. Yet, over time, these groups slowly blended together, creating a society that was neither fully European nor entirely new, but something in between. Traditions mixed, foods, farming techniques, and even words from different languages found their way into daily life. The land itself changed slowly. Forests were cleared for farmland, and rivers became essential routes for trade. Wooden bridges were built, crude at first, but improving with time. Horses and oxen pulled wagons loaded with goods. Their slow pace, the rhythm of early commerce. Roads remained rough, often turning to mud after rain, making travel difficult. A journey between towns that today would take less than an hour could require an entire day of walking or riding. Taverns became important social centers. They were places where travelers shared news from far-off colonies, where farmers gathered in the evening for a mug of ale, and where local politics were quietly discussed. In these taverns, ordinary people debated matters of taxes, trade, and the occasional rumor of European wars. But for most, politics felt distant. Their concerns were practical: whether the harvest would be good, whether the winter would be harsh, whether the roads would stay open long enough to trade before snow fell. Despite the hardships, moments of joy existed. Festivals marked the changing seasons. Harvest celebrations filled the air with music, dancing, and the smell of roasted meats. Weddings were simple but joyous, with neighbors contributing food, drink, and music. These events strengthened the bonds between families and reminded everyone that life, though hard, still had moments worth cherishing. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet life, subtle tensions grew. Colonists often disagreed with the distant governance of Europe that claimed ownership over the land. Taxes were sometimes imposed, new trade rules enforced, and settlers quietly resented having decisions made for them by people across the ocean. At this stage, it was only a faint undercurrent of frustration, not yet the roaring demand for independence that would come much later. But the seed of discontent had been planted, even if most people were too busy with daily survival to think much about it. The decades rolled on, slow and steady. Children became adults, took over their parents' farms, and raised families of their own. Some towns grew large enough to support specialized tradesmillers, coopers, and tailors. Others remained small clusters of cabins, isolated and quiet. There were no great battles, no famous speeches, just the ordinary rhythm of life. These are the moments that rarely appear in textbooks, the uneventful days that built the foundation of an entire nation. For every founding father whose name is remembered, there were thousands of nameless farmers, blacksmiths, mothers, and children whose daily struggles made the future possible. At night, after the day's work was done, families gathered by the fire. Candles flickered, casting soft light on rough-hewn walls. Someone might read a passage from a book, or simply sit in silence, listening to the crackle of burning wood. Outside, the world was still. The stars shone above, the same as they had for centuries, watching silently as a new society slowly took shape. In these small towns, history was not dramatic. It was patient, quiet, and unremarkable. Yet every fence built, every loaf of bread baked, and every trade made was a thread in the fabric of what would one day be called the United States. By the early 1700s, the colonies had grown. What had begun as scattered settlements now stretched across miles of coastline, connected by rough roads, winding rivers, and the steady movement of people and goods. Trade was no longer just a local exchange between neighbors. It began to link towns together, creating slow but steady connections that shaped colonial life. The earliest trade routes were simple. Farmers brought their produce barrels of apples, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese to nearby towns. Blacksmiths supplied nails, tools, and horseshoes. Millers ground wheat into flour, which was then carried by wagon to other villages. Each transaction was personal, a quiet negotiation often sealed with a handshake rather than a written contract. Coins were still rare. Barter remained common. A farmer might trade a side of pork for a new plow blade or a few yards of cloth for a bushel of corn. Rivers were vital highways. Flat-bottomed boats carried goods downstream, their sails catching the wind as they drifted past forests and meadows. Canoes and small skiffs ferried passengers across water, connecting places that roads could not easily reach. For many people, a trip by riverboat was their only glimpse of distant towns, a rare adventure in lives otherwise defined by routine. The goods being traded were modest flour, lumber, furs, tobacco, and simple household tools. But as the colonies grew, imported goods from Europe became increasingly valuable. Ships arrived carrying cloth, iron pots, books, and even luxury items like fine china and glassware. These items were treasured, passed down through generations as symbols of prosperity. To own a porcelain teacup or a silver spoon was to feel a little closer to the far-off cities of London or Paris. Ports began to bustle quietly, not with the energy of great cities, but with the steady work of dockhands, loading and unloading cargo. The sound of creaking ropes and rolling barrels filled the air as merchants inspected goods, discussed prices, and prepared shipments for the long journey back across the Atlantic. These ports became gathering places for information as well as goods. Sailors brought news from Europe, rumors of wars, changes in royal policy, or tales of exotic lands. For colonists who rarely traveled far, these stories were windows to a world they would never see. Inland towns, far from the coast, developed their own systems of trade. Wagon trains moved slowly over rutted dirt roads, often taking days to travel distances that today could be covered in hours. Drivers camped overnight by the roadside, cooking simple meals over small fires. The pace of commerce was slow, but it created a web of connections that steadily bound the colonies together. Taverns played an important role in this growing network. They were more than places to eat and drink, they were hubs of communication. A traveler arriving at a tavern might share news from another town, and by morning, that news would have spread to nearly everyone in the area. Notices of lost livestock, upcoming markets, or new shipments arriving at the port were often posted on tavern doors, where they could be read more often. Read aloud for those who could not read themselves. The colonial economy was simple but resilient. Families rarely specialized in a single trade. A farmer might also make barrels in the winter or weave cloth when not tending crops. Self-sufficiency was essential. Buying goods was a last resort when something could not be made at home. Even wealthier families relied on home production for much of what they used. Candles were poured, soap was boiled, and clothes were mended endlessly. The presence of enslaved labor became more noticeable in some colonies during this period. In the southern colonies, large plantations relied on enslaved people to cultivate crops like tobacco and rice. These plantations became centers of wealth and trade, but they were also places of quiet suffering, where human lives were reduced to labor and profit. The system of slavery was not yet the central political issue it would later become, but its shadow already stretched across colonial life, shaping economies and societies in ways that would have profound consequences. In northern towns, slavery was less common, though it still existed. Many families employed indentured servants, men and women who worked for several years in exchange for passage to the colonies. These servants were not enslaved for life, but their years of labor were difficult, and freedom was far from guaranteed. For most people, life was a struggle for survival, regardless of status. Wealth was rare, and comfort rarer still. Even as trade expanded, most people still lived and died within a small radius of where they were born. A trip to a neighboring town might be the farthest journey of their lives. The concept of a nation remained distant. People thought of themselves as residents of their town first, their colony second, and subjects of a distant king last of all. The affairs of Europe mattered little to them unless they directly affected taxes or trade. The colonial diet reflected this simplicity. Meals consisted mostly of bread, porridge, salted meats, and vegetables that could be stored through winter. Luxury foods like sugar or tea were precious, saved for special occasions. Coffee was a rare novelty. Milk, butter, and cheese were common. In areas with cattle, while fish and shellfish were staples near the coast, the variety of food was limited, but meals were hearty. Designed to sustain long days of labor, houses remained small and functional. Furniture was handmade, often from local wood. A table, a few chairs, and a bed might be all a family owned. Quilts and blankets were patched repeatedly until they could no longer be repaired. There was no concept of fashion in the modern sense. It was practical, passed down through families until it wore out completely. Yet despite the hardships, there was a sense of gradual progress. A new road built between towns could change lives. A bridge across a river might cut days off a journey. A single shipment of tools could allow dozens of families to repair roofs, fences, and wagons. These small improvements, invisible in the grand sweep of history, meant everything to the people living through them. Over decades, these quiet networks of trade and travel laid the groundwork for something larger. Colonists began to see themselves as part of a connected world. The word American was not yet in common use, but a shared identity was slowly forming, shaped not by politics, but by the practical realities of life in a new land. At night, towns grew quiet. The roads emptied, the taverns darkened, and only the soft flicker of candlelight showed where families sat together, sewing, carving, or simply resting after a long day. Outside, the forests and fields stretched endlessly, vast and silent under the starlit sky. It was a world where history moved at the pace of footsteps, where progress was measured in seasons, and where the foundations of a future nation were, quietly, patiently being laid, one trade, one road, one ordinary day at a time. As the 1700s moved forward, something began to change quietly in the colonies, not through battles or sudden events, but through the slow movement of words. The early settlements that once struggled merely to survive had grown into towns that could support schools, churches, and finally, printing presses. The ability to print words on paper, to copy ideas and stories, began to reshape colonial life very gradually, like ripples spreading across still water. In the earliest days, books were rare treasures. Most homes had only one or two, often a family Bible, and perhaps a worn almanac. An almanac contained useful facts, weather predictions, farming tips, and calendars of the moon and stars. These simple books were read over and over, their pages handled so frequently that the edges became soft and frayed. For many families, these books were passed down for generations, each copy carrying not just words, but memories. The arrival of printing presses changed this slowly. The first presses were small, heavy machines with wooden frames and metal type that had to be set by hand. Every single letter had to be arranged individually to form words, sentences, and paragraphs. Printing was hard work. Ink was spread on, the typepaper was pressed down, and each page was created one at a time. A single book might take weeks to produce. Newspapers were printed in small batches, and even then, copies were limited. Still, these presses opened a new world. Towns that could support a printer became hubs for information. Short pamphlets, broadsheets, and newspapers began to circulate, though slowly and in limited numbers. They contained local news announcements of markets, ship arrivals, public meetings, and even runaway notices for indentured servants or enslaved people who had escaped. Sometimes, these papers carried news from Europe, but by the time it arrived, it was often months old. For the colonists, however, this delay mattered little. Just having access to any written news was remarkable. People gathered at taverns or town squares to hear newspapers read aloud, especially for those who could not read. A single copy might be passed from hand to hand until the pages were worn and smudged. These small sheets of printed words connected people in ways that had not been possible before. Ideas, too, began to move more freely. Religious sermons, essays on morality, and even bits of political opinion found their way into pamphlets. Most of these writings were practical and unremarkable discussions about farming techniques, debates over taxes, or arguments about church doctrine. Yet, without anyone noticing at first, these humble publications were slowly knitting the colonies together. With shared thoughts and conversations, schools benefited as well. With printing, more textbooks became available. Children who once learned only from a single book could now practice reading from simple primers designed to teach letters and words. Education remained basic, but literacy slowly spread, especially in towns where printing presses operated. Reading was still a luxury skill, not universal, but each new reader meant that ideas could reach just a little farther. The spread of books also brought small pleasures. Collections of fables, poetry, and simple stories began to appear. These were not grand works of literature, but tales meant to entertain by candlelight after a long day. Families sat together, children listening intently as a parent read aloud. Laughter or gasps might follow a story, breaking the usual quiet of the home. For many, these evenings became the rare moments when life felt just a bit larger than the everyday tasks of farming, building, and surviving. Printing presses also gave rise to debates, quiet ones at first. Pamphlets allowed colonists to express opinions on taxes, trade policies, and religious freedom. These debates were not fiery or revolutionary yet. Most were polite exchanges of ideas written in formal, careful language. But as more people read and shared their thoughts, a new sense of awareness began to grow. People who once thought only of their small towns and farms started to realize that they were part of something bigger, a collection of colonies that, while far apart, shared similar challenges. This slow growth of shared knowledge built the foundation for what would come. Later, without these early presses, the colonies might have remained isolated from one another, each too focused on its own survival to think of unity. But as words traveled, whether by pamphlet, letter, or newspaper, the colonies began to feel a faint connection that transcended geography. Day after day, letters were arranged in rows, pages inked, and sheets hung to dry. The smell of ink and paper filled the small shops. Apprentices learned the trade, fetching type and cutting paper. It was not glamorous work, but it was meaningful in ways that few fully understood at the time. Each page printed was like a quiet seed planted in the minds of readers. Seeds that would one day grow into powerful ideas. Libraries, though still rare, slowly appeared. They were not like modern libraries with rows of shelves. Instead, they were often small collections of donated books kept in a meeting house or church. Members of the community could borrow books for a small fee, returning them after a set time. These shared collections allowed people who could not afford books of their own to experience the written word. Traveling preachers and lecturers also played a role in spreading ideas. When a speaker came to town, people gathered eagerly to hear new thoughts, even if the subject was as simple as farming improvements or a moral lesson. Afterward, the conversations would continue for days. For people whose lives were otherwise repetitive and quiet, these events brought a sense of connection to something beyond their own small world. Meanwhile, ships continued to arrive with new books, tools, and goods from Europe. Imported literature, philosophy, science, and history slowly found its way into the colonies. These works were often owned by the wealthy or the clergy, but their ideas trickled down through sermons, conversations, and borrowed books. Over time, the colonies became not just a place of survival, but a place where thought itself was beginning to expand. Yet for most people, life remained the same. Days were filled with chores, trade, and simple routines. Printing presses and books were part of the background, just another quiet presence in the slow rhythm of colonial life. Few could have guessed that these ordinary developments, the spread of literacy, the growth of printing, would one day help spark great changes. That as evening fell in these towns, the presses went silent. The apprentices swept the floors, stacked paper neatly, and extinguished the lamps. Outside, the streets darkened, the only sounds being the creak of wagon wheels or the distant bark of a dog. In homes lit by candlelight, people read aloud from newly printed pages, their voices carrying words that might have been set in type just that morning. In the stillness of these moments, history was quietly being made, not through battles or declarations, but through the slow sharing of thoughts, words carried on fragile sheets of paper that would eventually help shape a new world. By the middle of the 1700s, the colonies were no longer just isolated settlements. Along the coast, towns had grown larger, farms stretched deeper inland, and trade had slowly expanded. But there was still one great challenge that shaped daily life: the difficulty of communication. Without good roads or reliable mail systems, even a short distance could feel like a vast separation. Messages could take days, weeks, or even months to travel from one town to another. At first, there were no official postal routes. Letters were sent whenever someone happened to be traveling in the right direction. A neighbor going to a nearby town might be asked to carry a folded sheet of paper sealed with wax. If they remembered, they would hand it off to someone else along the way. There were no guarantees that a message would ever reach its destination. Sometimes letters were lost entirely, forgotten in saddlebags or ruined by rain. The earliest efforts to create postal services were slow and informal. Local governments and merchants began to organize regular deliveries between larger towns. Riders on horseback carried small bags of letters, traveling along rough dirt roads that were often muddy, rocky, or blocked by fallen trees. These roads were little more than wide paths cleared through the forest, winding around hills and rivers. Travel was slow, sometimes only a few miles per hour, and riders often camped overnight by the roadside. sleeping under the stars. The colonies eventually established more official postal routes, connecting towns along the coast. The first post offices were not separate buildings, but small rooms inside taverns or general stores. A traveler could walk in, ask if any letters had arrived, and leave their own messages for delivery. There were no street addresses. Letters were simply labeled with a name and town. The postmaster would hand the letter to the recipient when they came to check for mail. Despite these improvements, sending a letter remained expensive. Only wealthier colonists could afford to write frequently. Many families relied on word of mouth instead, passing messages through travelers or waiting for someone to return from a distant town. This slow pace of communication shaped life in the colonies. News spread gradually, and decisions were made, locally because it was too difficult to rely on far away. Governments for quick responses. Road building became a priority for many communities. The earliest roads were built by local towns, not by any central authority. Neighbors gathered with axes, shovels, and carts to clear trees, level the ground, and lay logs or stones in especially muddy areas. These corduroy roads, made from logs placed side by side, were bumpy and rough, but better than deep mud. Bridges were rare and expensive to build, so ferries were often used to cross rivers. Travel in winter became nearly impossible when snow buried the paths. Stagecoaches slowly appeared on the busiest routes. These heavy wooden carriages, pulled by teams of horses, carried passengers and mail between towns. The journey was far from comfortable, the roads were rough, and passengers were jolted with every bump. But for many, it was the fastest way to travel long distances. Inns and taverns sprang up along the routes, spaced a day's journey apart. Travelers would stop to eat, rest, and warm themselves by the fire before continuing the next morning. These developments might seem small today, but they quietly transformed colonial life. A farmer in one town could now learn of market prices in another town days instead of weeks later. Merchants could plan their shipments more effectively. Families separated by distance could finally exchange letters more reliably. The postal system also became a way for news to spread. Newspapers were bundled and carried along the routes, reaching towns that did not yet have their own presses. As more people gained access to news, conversations about taxes, trade, and local politics began to grow. It was not yet a revolution, just the slow building of shared knowledge across the colonies. Travelers were also messengers in another way. A merchant, a preacher, or a farmer on the road could share news just by talking to people they met. Stories of new roads, ships arriving in port, or even small-town disputes spread this way. These conversations became the colony's informal communication network, faster than letters, more personal than newspapers. Yet, for most colonists, life remained simple. Letters were still rare. A single piece of mail might be the most exciting event of the week. Families gathered as a parent or neighbor carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter, reading aloud the words sent from far away. Joy or sorrow might follow news of a birth, a marriage, or a death that had happened months before. The roads themselves became symbols of progress. Each new path cut through the forest made the colonies feel a little less isolated. What once took days to walk could now be reached by horseback in a single day. The feeling of distance slowly began to shrink, even though the world was still vast. Taverns along these roads thrived as places where riders and travelers rested. They became small centers of information where news, rumors, and ideas passed from person to person. A rider might bring a newspaper from a distant town, and by nightfall, the stories in that paper would be known to everyone gathered inside. Mail routes gradually improved, with riders carrying official pouches sealed to prevent tampering. The arrival of a mail carrier was often an event. People would gather at the post office to see if any letters had arrived, sharing gossip while they waited. In a world without telephones or telegraphs, these moments of connection were precious. Even as roads and postal routes expanded, travel remained slow. A trip between colonies that today could be made in hours still took days or weeks. The people who built these systems, post riders, innkeepers, wagon makers, rarely appear in history books, yet they were the ones who made it possible for ideas to move, for families to stay connected, and for the colonies to begin to see themselves as part of something larger. By night, these roads grew silent again. The stagecoaches stopped. The riders slept, and the only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant call of an owl. Under the stars, the roads were just empty paths cutting through a dark, quiet world. But these paths, muddy, rough, and unremarkable, were slowly shaping the future. They carried words and ideas, the lifeblood of a society that was, little by little, becoming something more than scattered towns. They were the threads weaving together the fabric of what would one day be called America. As the colonies grew, life became more complex. Towns that had once been little more than scattered cabins now had blacksmith shops, mills, and small markets. With more people came more disagreements over land, livestock, fences, and trade. It started in the simplest way possible. Communities began to create local governments. A group of men, usually landowners, would gather in the meeting house, which was often the same building used for church services. There were no fancy chairs, no desks, just wooden benches and tables. People spoke in turn, discussing issues like where to build a new bridge, how to repair a road, or what rules should be made about livestock wandering freely. Decisions were usually made by a show of hands or by a simple voice vote. These gatherings were slow and deliberate. There were no speeches like the ones later remembered from the revolution, just plain talk about ordinary problems. Most debates were about practical issues. If a cow kept breaking through a neighbor's fence, what should be done? If a road needed repairs, who would provide the labor? From these humble beginnings came some of the earliest forms of democracy. In America, they were not grand or idealistic, but they worked. People could voice their opinions and feel that they had some say in how their communities were run. The leaders chosen in these towns were not politicians in the way we think of them today. They were farmers, blacksmiths, or merchantmen who took on the role out of duty rather than ambition. Their responsibilities included keeping records, collecting small taxes, and ensuring that community rules were followed. Taxes were simple, usually small contributions of money, crops, or labor. A man might be required to work a few days on the town's roads instead of paying money. These taxes supported basic needs, repairs to bridges, maintenance of meeting houses, or the hiring of a school teacher. The earliest laws were also practical. Rules were made about the sale of land, the upkeep of fences, and the storage of gunpowder, which was necessary for hunting but dangerous if mishandled. Punishments for breaking these rules were often public but not severe. Someone might be fined for neglecting their duties or briefly placed in the town stocks, where passers-by could see them. Serious crimes were rare. Communities were small, and people depended on each other to survive. The idea of a formal police force did not exist yet. Instead, towns relied on constables, ordinary men chosen by the community to keep order. Their job was less about punishment and more about settling disputes before they escalated. Churches played an important role in shaping local laws. In many towns, religious and civic life were closely linked. Sermons often touched on moral behavior, reinforcing community rules about honesty, hard work, and fairness. While these rules could be strict, they provided a shared sense of order in a world where government was still far away. As towns grew, counties and colonies created courts for larger disputes. Judges traveled between towns, hearing cases about land ownership, trade disagreements, and crimes too serious for local meetings to handle. These courts were small affairs, often held in taverns or meat houses. A jury of local men would listen to arguments, and the judge would decide punishment or settlement. The system was far from perfect. Only certain people, usually men who owned property, could vote or hold office. Women, indentured servants, and enslaved people had no voice in government. Yet, for those who could participate, the act of gathering, debating, and voting became a habit that slowly shaped how colonists thought about power and fairness. Even as local governments formed, most colonists still felt little connection to the distant rulers in Europe. Governors appointed by the crown often seemed out of touch with the everyday struggles of farmers and tradesmen. Taxes imposed by faraway authorities caused quiet frustration, though most people were too busy surviving to protest loudly. Despite these challenges, the sense of self-reliance grew stronger. Each town learned to solve its own problems, to make its own rules, and to choose its own leaders. These habits would later become deeply important when the colonies began to question British rule. But for now, they were simply practical measures to keep life running smoothly. Life outside of these meetings went on as usual. Farmers tended their fields, blacksmiths hammered at their forges, and children fetched water or fed animals. Government was just one part of life, necessary but not dominating. At night, after a long day, the meeting house would stand empty, its single lantern extinguished. The town would fall quiet, lit only by the faint glow of candles and windows. People returned to their homes, where the same routines continued: supper, small talk, and rest before another day of work. There was nothing dramatic about these developments. There were no fireworks, no declarations of independence, no sense that history was being made. But slowly, these small acts of self-governance were laying the groundwork for a new way of life, one where ordinary people believed they had the right to make decisions for themselves. As the stars shone above the quiet towns, the seeds of democracy were being planted not with grand speeches, but with simple conversations about fences, roads, and cows. As towns became more established, the people living in them began to think about more than just survival. Fields had been cleared, homes were sturdier, and trade routes made life a little easier. Once the basic needs of food and shelter were met, communities started to focus on something new: education. It happened quietly, without much fanfare, one small school at a time. The very first schools were simple. In many towns, classes were held in a single room inside a church or meeting house. Sometimes, a teacher would gather children in their own home. The room might have a single long table or just benches along the walls. There were no chalkboards, no desks, just wooden slates, bits of chalk, and a few worn books that were shared among students. Teachers were usually men who had some education themselves, though not always much more than their students. In some towns, women taught the youngest children, running what were called dame schools out of their kitchens. Lessons focused on the basics, learning the alphabet, reading simple passages, writing one's name, and basic arithmetic. For many children, that was all the schooling they would ever receive. Books were scarce. The Bible was the most common reading material, and many children learned to read from its passages. As printing presses became more common, small primers were produced, simple books that taught letters and basic moral lessons. Pages were often illustrated with woodcut pictures, the ink smudged from heavy use. These primers were passed from child to child, their pages worn soft over time. Attendance at school was irregular. Children were needed at home to help with chores, especially during planting and harvest seasons. A boy might spend a few months in school each winter, when farm work was light, then return to the fields in spring. Girls often learned at home, helping with cooking, sewing, and caring for younger siblings. Still, many families valued education enough to send their children whenever they could spare them. Discipline in these schools was strict. Teachers were expected to keep order, often with a firm hand. Lessons were memorized and recited aloud. Children repeated letters, words, and numbers over and over until they could recall them without hesitation. Writing was practiced on slate boards. The letters scratched clumsily at first, then with more care as students improved. Despite the simplicity, these schools played an important role. They gave children skills that would help them read the Bible, sign documents, or keep basic records. Literacy spread slowly but steadily. In some colonies, especially in New England, laws required towns to establish schools once they reached a certain size. These laws reflected a belief that everyone should be able to read the scriptures, but they also laid the groundwork for a society where ordinary people could read and write for practical purposes. Education for girls was more limited, though some families taught daughters to read so they could read the Bible and manage household accounts. Wealthier families sometimes hired private tutors to educate their children in more advanced subjects like Latin or mathematics. For most, however, education remained basic. Books and printed materials became slightly more intellectual as trade expanded. Almanacs, which combined calendars with farming tips and bits of advice, were particularly popular. Families looked forward to these yearly publications, which helped guide planting, told of moon phases, and even included jokes and short stories. The famous Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Benjamin Franklin, became one of the most widely read publications in the colonies, filled with sayings about hard work and thrift. The growth of schools also led to new professions. School teachers became fixtures in towns, though their pay was small and their status modest. Some teachers traveled, working in different towns for a few months at a time. Others taught only during the winter, then returned to farming or other trades in the summer. Libraries were rare but slowly appeared. In some towns, groups of people pooled their money to buy books that everyone could borrow. These early libraries were often just a small chest or shelf of books kept in someone's home or the meeting house. Borrowers paid a small fee and were expected to return books in good condition. The collection might contain religious works, practical guides, and perhaps a few volumes of history or science. The quiet spread of education changed the colonies in ways that were not immediately obvious. More people could read letters, newspapers, and pamphlets. Ideas traveled more easily, carried not just by preachers and leaders, but by ordinary people who could read and discuss what they learned. This gradual increase in literacy helped create a sense of shared understanding, even among people who never traveled far from their towns. Still, for most families, life remained focused on survival. Children who attended school by day still spent mornings and evenings doing chores, feeding animals, gathering firewood, and helping with housework. School was just one part of their lives, not yet the central institution it would become centuries later. At night, homes glowed softly with candlelight as families gathered. A father might read aloud from a Bible or an almanac, his voice steady in the quiet room. Children listened, learning new words even when they weren't in school. The sound of reading became part of family life, a quiet ritual that connected generations. The towns themselves remained small, their roads still rough and muddy, but in these modest schools, with their splintered benches and shared books, something important was taking root. Knowledge, basic though it was spreading. It did not happen quickly, nor did it seem remarkable at the time, yet it prepared the colonies for a future in which ordinary people would play a role in shaping their own destiny. When the teacher extinguished the single candle that lit the room, the schoolhouse returned to darkness. Outside, the night was calm, the stars bright above the quiet town. The children walked home along narrow paths, their boots crunching softly on the dirt. Tomorrow, life would go on as before: chores, lessons, work, and rest. There were no great speeches, no dramatic moments, only the steady, patient act of learning. But these lessons, simple as they were, would help build the foundation of a nation still decades away from being born. By the mid-1700s, many colonial towns had grown from tiny clusters of cabins into small but lively communities. They were still far from cities, but something new was happening. Local markets and trades were slowly shaping the colonies into more connected economies. It was not fast, and it was not dramatic, but over time, these changes began to weave a stronger web between farms, towns, and ports. Markets were simple, often nothing more than an open space in the center of town. Once a week, farmers brought their goods, baskets of apples, sacks of grain, smoked meats, and jugs of cider to trade or sell. Merchants set up tables with items they had brought from other towns or even imported from Europe: bolts of cloth, nails, cooking pots, and tools. The market was more than just a place to buy and sell. It was also a place to meet neighbors, exchange news, and hear gossip from travelers. That there was rarely money involved in every transaction. Bartering remained common. A farmer might trade a dozen eggs for a small sack of flour, or a side of bacon for a few yards of cloth. Coins, when they were used, were a mix of currencies from different countries. Spanish, Dutch, and English coins all circulated together. Sometimes, even pieces of paper promising future payment were accepted. It was a messy system, but it worked because people knew and trusted one another. Tradesmen played an important role in these markets. Blacksmiths sharpened plow blades and repaired tools. Coopers made barrels to store grain, cider, and salted meats. Carpenters built furniture and wagons. Tailors mended clothes and occasionally made new garments for those who could afford them. Each trade was essential, and without these skilled workers, life would have been far more difficult. Merchants who traveled between towns became important figures. With wagons loaded with goods, they moved slowly along rough roads, stopping at farms and villages along the way. These traveling merchants carried not just goods, but also information, news of prices, rumors about distant events, and stories of life in other colonies. Their presence helped knit the colonies together in quiet, subtle ways. Some towns near rivers or along the coast became small centers of trade. Ships brought in goods from Europe: tools, books, fabric, and even luxury items like glassware and fine tea. In return, colonists sent out raw materials: lumber, furs, tobacco, and grain. These exchanges slowly tied the colonies to the rest of the world. Most families rarely saw imported goods, but when they did, they were treasured, kept carefully, repaired again and again, and sometimes passed down to the next generation. As trade expanded, inns and taverns along travel routes became even more important. Merchants needed places to rest, feed their horses, and exchange news. These stops became bustling with quiet activity: wagons arriving, horses being watered, travelers sitting by the fire eating bread and stew while discussing prices and markets. In a world without newspapers in every town, these taverns were vital for spreading information. Despite the growth of trade, most colonists still produced much of what they needed themselves. Families made candles, soap, and clothes at home. Shoes were repaired rather than replaced. Meals were cooked from what the farm produced: bread, porridge, vegetables, and salted meats. Markets provided what families could not make themselves, but self-sufficiency remained the rule. Market days were often the liveliest events of the week. Children followed their parents, marveling at the sights and smells: fresh bread, smoked fish, and spices brought from faraway places. For families living on isolated farms, market day was also a chance to see neighbors, hear the latest news, and feel part of a larger community. Seasonal fairs and festivals grew out of these markets. Harvest festivals, in particular, were important celebrations. Farmers gathered to sell surplus crops, musicians played fiddles, and people danced in the open air. These events were a rare break from the constant labor of farm life, moments of joy in otherwise repetitive routines. They also allowed tradesmen and merchants to do brisk business, selling tools, clothing, and other goods to large crowds. Trade also connected the colonies with Europe in deeper ways. Colonial merchants became middlemen, shipping goods produced by farmers and craftsmen overseas. As wealth slowly accumulated for some families, a new class of merchants and landowners emerged. Their homes were larger, their possessions more refined, and their influence in town meetings more significant. Still, most colonists remained poor farmers, their lives unchanged by the growing trade, except for occasional new goods at the market. Even as economies expanded, work was still hard and constant. Blacksmiths spent long hours at the forge, sweat rolling down their faces as they hammered red-hot metal. Farmers labored in fields from dawn until dusk, their hands calloused and backs sore. Tradesmen worked in dim workshops, shaping wood, leather, or iron by hand. There were no machines, no shortcuts, just human effort. Day after day. The small economies that developed in these years may not seem remarkable today, but they laid the foundation for the colony's future growth. The ability to trade, to connect towns through goods and services, gave colonists a sense of independence. They were no longer just scattered farmers, they were part of a network. Even if it was still slow and simple. At night, after market day ended, the town square would empty. The tables were packed away, the wagons rolled slowly home, and the air that had been full of chatter and noise grew quiet again. Families returned to their farms, tired but satisfied, their baskets full of goods that would last them through the week. There were no great events, no history-changing decisions, just the quiet hum of everyday life. Yet these markets, these trades, and these small economies were building something far greater than anyone realized at the time. Piece by piece, they were creating the structures that would one day support a nation. While merchants and trades slowly connected the colonies, most people still lived quiet, ordinary lives shaped by hard work and steady routines. The colonies were not filled with bustling cities or great events, but with farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who rarely left the places. They were born, their names were not recorded in history books for farmers, yet they formed the true backbone of colonial life. The first light of morning meant it was time to feed animals. Chickens, pigs, cows, and horses all needed attention before any other work could be done. Water was drawn from a well, often by hand, using buckets tied to ropes. Breakfast was simple: bread, porridge, or perhaps eggs, if the hens had been laying well. Once the animals were fed, the real work of the day began. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, weeds pulled, and crops harvested. There were no machines. Every furrow was carved by hand or by a wooden plow pulled by oxen or horses. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but it was essential for survival. A failed crop could mean hunger in the winter. Families kept careful track of food stores, how much grain was left, how many barrels of salted meat remained, because wasting food could be dangerous. Craftsmen lived different, but equally demanding lives. Blacksmiths worked near roaring fires, hammering glowing metal into tools, nails, and horseshoes. Carpenters spent long hours shaping wood into furniture, wagons, and barrels. Coopers, wheelwrights, tanners, and shoemakers all practiced trades that were essential to their communities. Their workshops were small and dimly lit, filled with the smells of wood shavings, leather, or smoke. Every item they made was by hand, each one slightly different from the last. Apprenticeships were common. Boys as young as 10 or 12 would be sent to live with a master craftsman, working for years in exchange for learning a trade. Apprentices swept floors, carried supplies, and slowly learned the skills of their craft. It was a long and often difficult process, but for many, it was the only path to a stable future. Women's work was just as demanding. They were responsible for cooking, sewing, and caring for children, but also for making candles, soap, and clothing. In many households, women helped in the fields as well, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Laundry was done by hand, with water carried from wells and heated over fires. Every task took time and effort, leaving little leisure. Children, too, had their share of responsibilities. Young boys helped with farm work, feeding animals, gathering firewood, and working in the fields. Girls learned to cook, spin, and sew from a young age. Childhood as we think of it today did not exist. Children were expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were able. Schooling, when it happened, fit around these chores. Days followed the rhythm of the seasons. Spring was for planting, summer for tending crops, autumn for harvesting, and winter for repairing tools and preparing for the next year. Life was measured not by clocks, but by daylight. When the sun rose, work began, and when it set, families gathered indoors for supper and rest. Meals were plain but filling. Bread, stews, and porridge formed the staples. Meat, when available, was salted or smoked to last through the winter. Milk, butter, and cheese were common where cows were kept. Vegetables like beans, squash, and corn were grown in gardens. Sugar and spices were luxuries, used sparingly when they could be obtained through trade. Homes were simple, often 1 or 2 rooms. Furniture was handmade tables, benches, and wooden beds with straw mattresses. Fireplaces provided heat and a place to cook. The air smelled of smoke, as fires burned constantly to keep the house warm and to prepare food. At night, candles or lanterns provided dim light, though many families simply went to bed shortly after dark. Sundays were different. For many, the day began with church, the most important social gathering of the week. Families dressed in their best clothes, often the same outfits worn for years, carefully patched and mended. The service was long and serious, with sermons focusing on morality and hard work. Afterward, neighbors talked outside, sharing news and arranging help for one another. There were moments of joy too. Weddings, barn raisings, and harvest festivals brought people together for music, dancing, and food. These events were rare but deeply meaningful. They reminded everyone that life, even in its hardships, could still hold happiness. Work never truly ended. After supper, tools were repaired, clothes mended, and candles poured. Only then did families gather by the fire. Sometimes a father would read from the Bible or an almanac. Sometimes stories would be told, simple tales passed down from earlier generations. Children listened quietly, their eyes heavy with sleep. At night, towns grew silent. The forge fires were out, the workshops empty, and the fields quiet under the moonlight. Dogs barked occasionally, and crickets chirped, but otherwise the world was still. Tomorrow would bring the same work again: planting, forging, sewing, mending. There were no great events, no heroic moments, just the slow, steady rhythm of everyday life. Yet this quiet work built the colonies. Every plow pulled through the soil, every nail hammered into wood, every loaf of bread baked were the acts that made the colonies survive. The farmers, craftsmen, and laborers may not be remembered by name, but they were the true foundation on which everything else stood. Their lives were not dramatic, but they were vital. Without them, there would have been no towns, no trade, no future cities. They lived, worked, and died in relative obscurity, leaving behind no monuments or statues. Yet their daily routines carried a quiet strength that shaped the land far more than the famous figures whose names fill history books. As the night deepened, families drifted to sleep, their homes dark except for the faint glow of cooling embers. In the fireplace, outside, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, the same stars their ancestors had seen in Europe, now shining on a new world. Life would continue tomorrow, much as it had today, slowly, steadily, and without fanfare. As the 1700s moved closer to their end, the colonies looked different from how they had begun. Villages had grown into towns, roads connected places that had once felt impossibly far apart, and ships regularly carried goods and letters across the Atlantic. But despite these changes, most people still lived as their parents and grandparents, had quiet, hard-working lives, focused on family, faith, and survival. There were still no grand cities dominating the landscape. Most towns were modest, with wooden buildings, muddy streets, and a meeting house or church at the center. The market square, the blacksmith shop, and the tavern were the busiest places. Yet even they were calm compared to the cities of Europe. The colonies were still a land of farmers, craftsmen, and traders who thought of themselves first as residents of their town or colony, not as Americans. Every day, countless small acts kept life moving forward. A farmer plowed his fields, thinking only of the harvest to come. A blacksmith hammered a plow blade, knowing that someone depended on it for their crops. A teacher wrote out lessons on a slate board, not realizing that one of her students might one day play a role in shaping history. None of them imagined they were building a nation. They were simply living their lives. The colonies had slowly grown richer and more connected, but life remained full of hardship. Winters were still cold and unforgiving. Crops sometimes failed, and diseases swept through towns without warning. A letter from a loved one could still take months to arrive. It arrived at all. The world remained slow, shaped by seasons and daylight rather than clocks and schedules. Yet beneath the quiet surface, something was happening. The habits formed in these towns gathering to make decisions, trading goods with neighbors, teaching children to read were creating a society that was different from the one left behind in Europe. People were used to solving their own problems. They had grown accustomed to electing town officials, debating rules, and shaping their communities with their own voices. They were also growing more literate. More people could read newspapers, letters, and pamphlets. Ideas about freedom, rights, and government's far-off concepts discussed only by scholars were slowly reaching ordinary farmers and tradesmen. The printing press, the roads, and even the postal routes few colonists thought about rebellion or independence. Most were too busy working their farms, raising their children, and surviving each day. The great events that would later define American history had not yet come. For now, life was steady, repetitive, and ordinary. Families still gathered each evening around the fire. The glow of a single candle or a hearth lit their faces as they mended clothes, repaired tools, or simply rested after a long day. Someone might read aloud from a Bible or an almanac. Children listened quietly, their heads resting on their parents' laps as their eyes grew heavy with sleep. Outside, the towns were silent. The stars shone above fields that had been plowed by hand, homes that had been built one timber at a time, and roads that had been cut through the wilderness by ordinary men with axes and carts. These small, forgotten acts, felling a tree, clearing a field, teaching a child to read, were the true foundation of what would one day become the United States. No one celebrated them, no one wrote about them in the history books, but they were the quiet work that made everything else possible. When the great events finally came, when people began to speak of independence, liberty, and self-reliance, colonies were ready in ways they themselves did not yet understand. The habits of self-governance, the spread of ideas through books and pamphlets, and the growing connections between towns had all prepared them for what lay ahead. But for now, the people slept, unaware of the future. The fires in their hearths burned low, the tools in their workshops lay quiet. The roads, so busy during the day, were empty under the moonlight. Life was slow, simple, and steady, and in that quiet, unnoticed by anyone. History was being made not through battles or speeches, but through the patient work of countless ordinary lives. Night falls on the colonies for the last time in our story. The year is moving toward the late 1700s. Change is on the horizon, but for now, life is much the same as it has been for decades. Families finish their simple suppers, bread, stews, and porridge, and gather around their hearths. The fires crackle softly, warming the rooms while shadows flicker on the rough wooden walls. Children sit on benches, tired from a day of chores, while parents mend tools, sew clothing, or prepare for the next day's labor. A father might read from the Bible or a dog-eared almanac, his voice steady as the candlelight dances on the pages. For most, this is all life has ever been: work, quiet evenings, and a constant cycle of planting, harvesting, and surviving. The colonies are stronger than they once were. Roads now connect distant towns. Postal riders deliver letters more reliably. Printing presses spread ideas and stories. Small markets bustle each week with trade. Schools, though simple, give more children the chance to read and write. Yet even with these changes, most people do not feel that they are living through history. They see themselves only as farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and mothers, ordinary people doing what they must to provide for their families. Their names will not be remembered. Their lives will not fill the pages of history books. But without them, there would be no America. Every fence built, every loaf of bread baked, every letter carried along a muddy road, these were the quiet acts that made a future nation possible. Soon, voices of rebellion will rise. Pamphlets will spread fiery words about liberty and subtle rule. There will be meetings, protests, and finally, war. But none of it could happen without the foundation laid by those who came before, the men and women who cleared forests, built towns, and taught their children to read and think for themselves. They were not heroes in the way history remembers heroes. They were simply people living their lives, never knowing that the world would one day look back and realize that their ordinary work was extraordinary in its own way. As night deepens, homes grow silent. Fires burn down to embers, casting a faint glow in the darkness. Outside, the towns rest under a wide sky filled with stars. The same stars that guided ships across the ocean, watched over plowed fields, and shone down on every quiet act of labor that built a country. Tomorrow will bring the same tasks as today, feeding animals, repairing tools, working the land. But time is moving forward, slowly, steadily. The lives of these ordinary people have created something greater than themselves. This is how America began, not with grand speeches or great battles, but with quiet days, steady work, and countless forgotten lives that shaped the world in ways they could never imagine. And so the story ends as softly as it began. A land built not in a single moment, but in the slow passage of time, by people whose only thought was to survive, raise their families, and leave something behind for those who came after them.